After years of debate and planning, the EU's new migration policy came into force today. New measures include tougher border controls, a more streamlined asylum process and speedier deportations. But will the new system deliver on its promise of making things better for member states that want stricter controls on migrant flows into the bloc and for the hundreds of thousands seeking asylum? Here's what to expect.
This is what the EU migration policy is often associated with. Overcrowded reception centres, sometimes with dire living conditions and lengthy procedures with complicated rules. But a new scheme coming into effect now to manage asylum applications is hoping to change all this.
We promised a new system that is fair with those eligible for protection, that is firm with those who are not, and that is strong against the traffickers and the networks preying on the most vulnerable of people. Tonight we have delivered on that promise.
Yet some are sceptical the bloc can actually deliver on its promises.
We think that the migration pact of the European Union is in line with escalation in border violence and violation of the fundamental human rights.
So what's going to change? We break down the main points. According to the new scheme, every migrant arriving at the EU external border has to be screened. This includes preliminary health and vulnerability checks as well as security checks. The migrants are identified and registered in a database. Within 7 days, a decision must be made whether the person is eligible for asylum or could potentially face deportation. Eligible asylum seekers may also be subjected to a so-called border procedure, especially if they come from a country with a low recognition rate for asylum. This entails being held in a detention facility at their first point of entry for up to 12 weeks, while their application is being reviewed. We asked Helena, Hahn, a migration expert at the European Policy Centre in Brussels, whether this can work.
Beyond a question of whether there is sufficient political will in order to comply by the rules, there's the big question of whether, in practice, member states are sufficiently prepared.
In May, an EU Commission report flagged that around 10 member states needed to urgently step up efforts to establish adequate capacity for border procedures. EU officials say member states made significant progress since.
Are the member states ready? Mostly yes, I would say, but of course there are some minor gaps in some member states on IT issues or on infrastructure.
The EU's migration chief also stressed that ensuring human rights standards according to international law was a prerequisite for the reform. But some are still concerned.
We can see that the new procedures of the European Union and of member states like Italy are clearly implementing mass pushbacks and possible mass deportation with no respect of a proper evaluation of the single position and single conditions of risk for the asylum seekers.
In recent years, some EU countries reintroduced border checks within the bloc, citing irregular migration as one of the reasons. Some expect that with the implementation of the new scheme with its stricter external border controls, those measures would be lifted. But is this going to happen soon?
No, in the last few months we have been able to see how effective our measures are in pushing back illegal migration, and it is precisely these successes that must not be jeopardized now. That is why it is still necessary for our measures to take effect.
Germany and other European states want to prevent secondary migration. This means stopping people who had arrived in one EU state from moving on to another one.
There are a number of measures that aim to disincentivize onward movement. We can think about, for instance, detention, or we can think about stricter obligations on asylum seekers to remain where they are until their application is processed. But all of that of course, exists on paper at the moment and doesn't necessarily mean that people may not still try to move onward.
The German Interior Minister insists that the so-called Dublin rules have to work again before he fully lifts the border controls. Under this principle, the country in which a person arrives remains responsible even if they move on to another EU state, and they can be sent back to that country from elsewhere in the bloc. This principle was deemed unfair by the countries at the EU's external border, but it is still in place under the new scheme, with an added new element. The new pact includes what the EU calls flexible solidarity. In the past, the bloc tried to force member states to take in a fair share of asylum seekers from countries at the external border. Now, mandatory relocation quotas are replaced with the option to instead contribute financially or operationally to at-the-border member states. Cyprus, Greece, Italy and Spain would have access to the solidarity pool as they are considered to be under migratory pressure.
A large number of member states are primarily interested in financial contributions or willing to make them. We also know, of course, at the end of the day, that countries such as Italy or Greece, who have in the past faced high arrival numbers, would benefit the most from relocations.
The EU wants to see a minimum of €600 million funneled into the Solidarity Fund annually, as well as a minimum of 30,000 relocated migrants within the bloc per year. Hungary has already indicated that it remains reluctant to take in migrants or pay. Other countries like Poland have already secured exemptions.
Right now, the European Union and the countries are more concentrating on what they call the external dimension of migration, meaning they want to find places where they can send rejected asylum seekers to once they are not allowed to stay in Europe anymore.
Denmark is working together with the Netherlands, Germany, Austria and Greece to set up these so-called return hubs. The group wants to present first concrete results by the end of this year.
Shana Tabak is director of the Climate Mobility Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research looks at the impact of climate change on global migration. Welcome to DW. You've written that the EU's new migration policy is stuck in the past and not suited to today's realities. What did you mean by that?
Well, when we look at the EU policy, we realize that the policy was designed in response to real challenges exposed by previous migrant flows to the EU. For example, the massive inflow in 2015 or inflows regarding the Ukraine crisis. But today, in 2026, we know a lot more about the impacts that climate change has on where and how people can live. And one of my concerns with this piece, with this pact, is that it doesn't adequately consider and anticipate the ways in which climate change can act as a driver or as an accelerant of migration.
Explain why that matters if what you are doing is trying to control volumes of people, trying to control and process volumes of people. If climate change essentially acts as an accelerant to that, if you have a robust system, which Brussels would claim this is, then does it matter why they are coming?
Well, I would argue that it does. So we know that climate change impacts like flooding, extreme heat, sea level rise, or drought is affecting where people can live both in Europe and across the globe. And as I mentioned, these climate impacts really interplay with other drivers of migration. And so if Europe is interested in understanding how and why people are making the difficult choice and the difficult journey to come to live in Europe, then there are ways that that can be done, that Europe needs to really be anticipating the drivers of that migration from countries across the globe. And so, while there is no direct line from climate impact to displacement, we do know the general compass direction. And if Europe is designing a policy for the reality of our knowledge in 2015, I would argue that it's outdated since we have a greater understanding of the impacts that climate change does have on displacement now in 2026.
What is missing then in practical terms? What does this new policy fail to do? I'm not talking about anticipating, I'm talking about it says we should do this, we should open distribution centres, we should process people within 7 days. What does it fail to do that climate change will expose?
Well, so one of the main premises of the pact is the concept of deterrence. And what we know, scholars know that over and over, deterrence doesn't help prevent migrants from making dangerous journeys. So if a person is forced from their home because extreme heat has meant that they can no longer provide for their family, they will still choose to make that difficult journey. So what the pact is missing is really thinking about the opportunities that this moment in time offers to align migration policy with development policy, foreign aid policy. And so, for example, there are ways in which the EU can both be thinking about ensuring that it has a safe and well-managed border system, while also investing in systems that can prevent people from having to have lives in which climate change is forcing them to leave their homes.
What is the best thing you see in this policy?
Well, I think that there are a number of opportunities in this policy that really do offer opportunities for the EU to think in a great way about the impacts of climate change and how it intersects with migration. So, for example, there is a piece of the policy that addresses the need for skills and talent mobility partnerships. We know that in the EU right now, we have an aging population, and we're going to face shortages of labor. And so the pact actually does nod to the potential of migrant workers to contribute to the green and digital transitions in the EU. And so I see that as one opportunity for pathways that can provide a win both for the European economy as well as for migrants who are seeking opportunities as well.
Migration is clearly an inflammatory political issue around the world at the moment. Would you agree that the EU is right to do what it can to improve an outdated system and take some of the heat out of those arguments and taking some of the heat as well out of the far-right talking points?
So, it's clear from what we saw in the past that the EU system was outdated and lacked some internal coherence. And so I think the EU was smart to try and think about how can we look forward and create a better system to ensure the human rights and the dignity of people migrating. And I think the issue when we think about the political dynamics is it's not, both in the left and the right are going to have criticisms of this new pact. What I think is most concerning is that when we talk about a tougher migration policy, that really plays into what I would argue is a crisis mentality with regard to migrants. And when we think about the ways in which climate change impacts the choice to leave someone's home, what we really know is that when people are displaced by climate impacts, it's not the people who are leaving that pose the crisis, but it's really the impacts of climate on where and how we live that is the crisis. So I think that is really the conversation that politicians need to continue to have as we think about the intersection between climate change and human mobility or human migration.
Thanks for joining us, Shana Tabak from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Thank you.